Hello, I'm Howard. I've worked in UK railway engineering for nearly 20 years in everything from maintenance, renewals, and fault response to project work, design work, and management. I'm a big fan of spooky season, and I wanted to do some sort of Halloween special videos for October. Anybody that's worked on the railway for any length of time will have their own spooky and ghost stories because the railway is a naturally creepy place with its own history and tragedy, as any old thing is. I wanted to start with Sough Tunnel, which is a railway tunnel, quite long, over a mile, around the Darwin and Blackburn area. I went through this tunnel on my own at night in July of 2022, but I wanted to go back a bit before that and start with my first experience of this tunnel in terms of learning about it and its history. So I had a colleague called Mike who was going off to do some scoping work for a project that he was doing in the tunnel at night on his own. And there's a local S&T technician, signal and telecoms technician, that got wind of Mike going and knew him a bit. So he sent him an email outlining a bit of the tunnel's history, which is funny, trying to freak him out before he goes. But also it enlightened me to the history of this tunnel, which we'll look at now. So let's look at this email from Roy to Mike, who he knew was going on his own. So when I first got forwarded this email, I thought it was a wind up and he was just trying to frighten Mike a bit. But it turns out an alarming amount of what he says is true and worse when we look into the history. So he said, "Hi Mike, I believe you're going through Sough Tunnel on Thursday night. Just to give you a bit of a heads up info on the tunnel. It's about three-quarter of an hour long walk through the tunnel. It's 2,015 yards long and a bore of 22 feet, and there are 13 vent shafts in the tunnel, which was unlucky for the 5 men killed in the tunnel, which are buried in the walls of the tunnel due to the cost of recovering the bodies. And there's a risk in one of the shafts, which is 260 feet to the surface and is haunted by one of the men who got killed boring the longest shaft. So when you go through the tunnel, just be aware of the draft you might feel in the tunnel. And if you do feel it, like me and Mark did last time we went through on nights, it's not a train like we thought it was. And don't worry about any voices you hear. The P-Way gang hear voices in there all the time, and you just get used to it. So if you need any more info on the tunnel, just ask me, mate, as I'm a Darwin lad and have a good local knowledge of the tunnel. So just take your hair going through, and good luck, Roy." Mike was so frightened after this email that he managed to convince another member of staff to go with him on this excursion. And I didn't even know this when I went, but there is actual truth to the bodies being buried in the walls story, although not quite the walls. Looking at the Entwistle Family History Association, they have an article on this tunnel, which they have kept historical record of, and they say a most macabre incident is recorded during the Sough Tunnel construction. Two Turton men, which is another little town in the local area, father and son, were employed to fill the unwanted shaft number 5 of the 13 shafts that were built for air vents from a wooden stage spread across the 10-foot diameter surface opening. An overnight storm had washed out much of the loose earth from underneath where the platform rested on the edge of the shaft. When both men stepped onto the delicately poised planking, it tilted sharply downwards, plunging them to their deaths 100 feet below. An avalanche of stony rubble cascading down the partly filled cavity effectively entombed them. Attempts to retrieve their bodies, as well as that of a labourer who fell into shaft number 9, were abandoned, and some weeks later the openings were completely closed. And shaft number 6, rising midway along the tunnel, was the deepest of them all, and it claimed 12 years old Billy Goodbeer as a victim. His job was to run to the smithy with picks that the men had sent up for resharpening. Bored with waiting and watching the hopper as it came up the shaft laden with spoil, he gave the hopper a playful swing, and it rebounded and it knocked the hapless child over the brink of the 260-foot shaft. And here was me thinking he was just winding people up. So as I walked through that tunnel, I didn't realise at the time that there was bodies buried above my head in the shafts that the abandoned have filled in, with people still in them. The shafts are also quite something to behold. I didn't realise when I was looking up the longest shaft that 12-year-old Billy Godbeer had apparently fallen down it. It's pretty spooky. Looking up into it, all you can see is the tube of brickwork all the way up. You can't see the top. It's just too high. Not in darkness anyway. Maybe you could see it in the daytime, but there's just water running through it. It's a very wet tunnel system. When they were building the tunnel, there were several accidents where they collapsed mines further down because they disturbed the water table. This is one of Sough Tunnel's shafts. It has two shaft turrets like this that protrude quite far out of the Darwin moors, and they help release the air pressure created inside by the moving trains. It does get very drafty in there, as Roy described, perhaps not due to hauntings, but due to the you've got a tunnel that's a mile long with all these vent shafts in it. There's quite a bit of air moving around, and it can happen quite suddenly. That's quite spooky. You just get a random rush of air every now and then as the pressure equalizes around with the wind up top. So this tunnel was opened over 170 years ago now. They started building it in 1845, and it took just under 3 years to build, and it was finished for 1848. It was noted that the conditions for the workers, mostly coal miners from South Wales and Irish navvies and people from the Wigan area, were appalling, and 5 people in total lost their lives during the construction. Also, a rock formation they burrowed through, consisting of sandstone and shale, disrupted some underground streams and flooded a local coal mine and polluted all the streams. And when the tunnel did open, they found it very difficult to work in there and work on the tunnel because of the amount of smoke. It didn't really get rid of the smoke as much as they thought it would. The problem was partly solved by reopening 2 of the original shafts, one at 158 feet and another at 210 feet. But still, many people dreaded the tunnel because of the smoke, and there were reports of staff being trapped. Obviously, this problem went away in the 60s with the introduction of diesel locomotives. For the 5 people that died, life before they died wasn't particularly great either. Most of the workers would live in makeshift huts up on cranberry moss in groups. The Parliamentary Select Committee inquiry on railway labourers in 1846 described those navvies' housing as basic wood and turf huts with a fireplace either side and provided accommodation for 20 to 30 people. The beds would be arranged in tiers and often had multiple occupants. The accommodation was described as wet and unhealthy and insalubrious and fetid. The construction workers and their families were camped in the fields around the hamlet for over 2 years, and law and order was allegedly practically non existent, living on a bleak hillside in open shelters made for a hard life. There were many social problems, with labourers working 6 days a week for a gold sovereign, working in shifts. Women and children often worked alongside their menfolk without pay. Gambling and fighting seemed to be popular pastimes. And there was one Irishman whose favourite trick was to bet anybody that he could hang by a rope tied around his neck from a ceiling beam. The price of this wager was £5, and he had performed this trick many times. But sadly, in 1847, at the Whittleston Head Tavern in Darwin, he lost his bet. So overall, a pretty grim and dark history in Sough Tunnel. It is also reported from the local maintenance teams that they do hear voices and there are strange goings on in the tunnel. The drafts can probably be explained by the air dynamics in the tunnel. Mike, I spoke to him after his visit and he didn't experience anything too paranormal, but just said it was a bit spooky. And I have to say that on my visit, thankfully, I didn't know all that stuff beforehand. I only looked at that after. But had I have known, maybe it would have influenced what I saw. It is a bit creepy, and the sudden gusts of wind are a bit weird. But no floating headless ghosts, no things flying around the tunnel of their own accord, nothing like that. It is just a bit of a spooky place. I mean, at least when I was there, it could be a whole lot worse next time. Maybe avoid going there again. Anyway, join me next time on the channel. I've got some more. There's a difference with some of these. Some of them, it goes beyond just sort of word of mouth and hearsay. I mean, this had some recorded history to it, but there are some incidents with ghosts and hauntings and paranormal activities that get officially recorded. And some of these things get looked into, but I'll save that for the next episode. Have a good evening.